Now for one of my favorite time periods, the 1920s. There will be tons of film clips in this, but just pay attention to them. I know you guys race through them, but it'll get you in the time period and get you to understand what a unique time period in America it was. So still Unit 16, but moving on to the 1920s. This should give you a really good idea of what life was like in the 1920s. So we're going to talk about all different aspects of life and culture. Let's begin with prohibition. This is a big thing in the 1920s. So the 18th Amendment, of course, does that in 1919. Most people just ignored it and found other ways around it. So it actually backfires on American society and ends up making a rise in organized crime. And this is where Al Capone will come in, which we'll talk more about him later. But this is where he really finds his wealth. So Al Capone illegally bringing alcohol to people who are desperate to have it, and it because it's a forbidden fruit, I guess you could say, it really glamorized drinking. And women, for the first time, are really going to get into drinking. You see the party over here, how many women are in the party. And this is actually a party ending prohibition. Both of them are. But that glamorized drinking meant that they needed a place to drink. And these underground, not literally underground, but these secret bars opened up all over the place. And you were supposed to speak softly about their existence so the police wouldn't find out. And that speak softly became speakeasies. So the speakeasy is that underground illegal place to go and drink. And in those speakeasies, all kinds of new music developed. And that is one of the things that I think sets the 1920s apart from any other decade. The music is just amazing. So let's talk about that music, and I'm going to let you listen to a lot of clips. The first topic that we have to talk about for the 1920s is jazz. So the number one guy for jazz is Duke Ellington. Yes, I have a clip, and I expect you to listen to at least part of it so you understand what jazz is. So listen to that. The second guy we're going to talk about is Louis Armstrong. Louis was famous for the blues. Usually they told stories, sometimes sad, but not always. Blues makes it sound like it's sad, but listen to Louis Armstrong, an amazing, amazing entertainer. The third group that you need to know about is the Harlem Dancers. And this is not a one specific group. It's not the same people that always stick together. But what they did was fantastic. The entertainment and the new moves to dances. So watch this. You'll like this. There were also a lot of changes in white entertainment. So far I've shown you a lot of very popular, very famous black entertainers, but there were a lot of changes in the white world as well. And mostly it's going to come in the form of dancing and music for the white audience. So you see at the top some of the more popular types of dances, the Charleston, the Black Bottom. You can see the picture of the Black Bottom where they actually rub their bottoms together. 10 years before that, that would have been unheard of. You would have been arrested for obscene behavior in public, but now it's the thing of the day. The turkey trot down there on the bottom, and then, of course, you probably all know the tango. But yes, I have a clip, so it'll show you a bunch of dances all combined into one in this clip. It's very entertaining, so watch it. Don't fast forward. I will know if you do. Literature was also alive in the 1920s, and this is when we get our first wave of very popular black writers. And probably the most beautiful black writer of the time is Langston Hughes. And Langston Hughes encouraged that new mantra of the time, black is beautiful. So I think it's still around today. I know I heard it a lot when I was a kid, but Langston Hughes wanted black individuals to realize that they were not slaves anymore. They were not second class citizens, that they meant something. And so that tagline, Black is Beautiful, he used it a lot. And one of his most famous writings is called Mother to Son. Make sure you know that. Langston Hughes, Mother to Son. He's part of a movement called the Harlem Renaissance. And that is mostly black artists that are coming up with poetry, music, all kinds of things to add to the culture of the 1920s. So it began in Harlem, New York. So it got the tagline Harlem Renaissance, but it's happening all over the United States. So take a minute to listen to his piece of poetry, Mother to Son. It's very beautiful, and I'll give you an idea of his great talent. We also have some crazy new kind of adventure novels coming out. F. Scott Fitzgerald is, he's not part of the Harlem Renaissance. He was a white guy, but very, very famous in this time period for his book, The Great Gatsby. And it is about all the things you see here in front of you, but the number one thing is excesses. So there was a film made about based on this book, The Great Gatsby, and I'm going to let you look at a clip of that, and it will explain to you that idea of excesses. So F. Scott Fitzgerald was kind of um, not making fun of rich people, but bringing out into light the extravagant excesses, the waste of money. The 1920s, the rich people are doing that. They're having these parties that are just beyond belief. And so I'm going to let you see a party scene from that movie, The Great Gatsby, and it's pretty daggone accurate. So it should give you an idea of what life was like among the rich. So make sure you know F. Scott Fitzgerald for The Great Gatsby. And here's that clip. Within the 1920s, America also develops for the very first time a consumer culture where we are constantly looking for new things and we shift. This is important. We shift to disposable products and time saving appliances. Who do you think the main audience is going to be? You can see it in all the ads here. It's women. So, products that you don't have to do the drudgery of housework anymore, vacuum cleaners, wash machines, even new refrigerators where you don't have to go down to the store every single day if you're going to cook something that was cold. So women's lives are going to change dramatically in the 1920s because of disposable products and new appliances. So how are they going to pay for all this stuff? They're going to use credit cards. So the 1920s is when people really, for the first time, start using credit in massive scales. And that starts in America. America's the first one to have a credit card. So, and it was American Express, by the way. The grandeur of this time period, the 1920s, is going to lead to architectural projects like the world has never seen before. And the most famous architecture of the time is Frank Lloyd Wright. He was a kind of guy that wanted his buildings to blend in with nature. He believed in harmony with nature. And so this one probably is the most famous of all of them, the Bear Run in Bear Run, Pennsylvania, where he built the house over the waterfall. It didn't not disturbing nature any more than he absolutely had to. So let's look at some more of his designs. There we have the Elam House in Austin, Minnesota. He's even gone to Tokyo. Frank Lloyd Wright was a well known name across the world. His buildings impressed and awed people, but he was always in the newspaper as well. He was always having affairs, getting himself into trouble. So he was a pretty flamboyant character, but he will be remembered forever for the beautiful architecture that he did across the world. This one is, if you're the kind of person that follows gossip, this might be your favorite place. It definitely was during the time period. Spring Green, Wisconsin is where Frank Lloyd Wright built a house for one of his mistresses. Notice I said one of, and her two children. And the reason it became super famous, she was kind of hush hush, and I can't even remember her name. It doesn't really matter, but it's the story behind it because Frank Lloyd Wright was always in the middle of the media somehow. So he builds her this house in the middle of nowhere, beautiful mansion, and visits her as often as he can and her two children. And for some reason, one day her male cook went crazy while she was having lunch with some visitors, and it was her and her two children who are females and four gentlemen that were there for a business meeting. The cook killed the three women with a hatchet, and then he sealed the four men up in a room after dousing the entire room with gasoline, he locked them in and set it on fire and killed them all. And of course, he survived, but even he couldn't say why he did it. We'll never know, I guess, why he killed any of them. But of course, that got Frank Lloyd Wright in the newspaper once again. The Guggenheim Museum is also a Frank Lloyd Wright building. You may not know that. It really, truly is not so much a museum to hold objects that you would come in and look at and ooh and ah over. I mean, that stuff is there. You can see it in the picture, but it's the building itself that is the awe-inspiring thing when you get there. And if you're the kind of person that gets seasick or you have problems with balance, you're not going to be able to go into the Guggenheim. The flow of it will actually make you feel like you're moving on the water, and a lot of people can't walk through the entire Guggenheim, they get sick. But he designed it that way, that he could control nature, he could control people, he could make you feel a certain way even if you didn't want to, and he definitely succeeded. So Guggenheim Museum in New York City, all of these are Frank Lloyd Wright. Entertainment changed just like everything else was changing in society in the 1920s. And with the new types of media, the newspaper doing all kinds of crazy stories with the yellow journalism, the radio was doing it as well. They had film for the first time. And so media stars were really changing the way that people looked, the way that they acted. And you see the two most famous entertainer, well, among the two most famous entertainers of the 1920s is Charlie Chaplin, who started out as a silent film star. And when we start getting sound in films, those are called talkies, and he becomes a star in that as well. So the way that he dressed in his films encouraged the dress of the men of the time. They dressed just like him. And this middle picture of these men, I love this. This is actually a mugshot of some guys who were caught running liquor, and but even the bad guys dress like Charlie Chaplin. For the females, Joan Crawford was one of the major loves, and the ladies all wanted to look like her. So you see the hairstyle that she has, and then you see the picture of the ladies down below, just average, ordinary housewives, but they have that Joan Crawford style. So this is when you get the media of movies and ads and newspapers and magazines really influencing society for the very first time as far as fashion and fads go. So let's take a little bit of a deeper look at Charlie Chaplin, but no Charlie for the male superstar of the time and Joan for the female superstar of the time. So, Charlie Chaplin was a very unique character. His dad ran off when he was still really little, like 3 or 4 years old. His mother almost immediately went into an insane asylum and never came out of there. So, he grew up in the poorhouse, literally in the poorhouse, and where he was pretty much a slave of the people who ran the poorhouse, but he would sneak out and go visit the theater. And so, he became this major talent. Watching other people do what they did encouraged him to start practicing his own means of entertainment, and he just became this super believable movie star in a time period when movies are still very rough, very hard to produce. A lot of it is nothing but your facial expressions, of course, when before we had the talkies. So also, I'll let you watch a film clip, one of the most famous film clips of his. He tried to incorporate humor in his acting and did a pretty good job with those facial expressions. But here is his home. We actually got to visit in Kerry, Ireland. He's from London. But before he died, he made it so big in Hollywood type stuff that he had 20 homes all over the world. Here's a kid that came out of the poorhouse. 20 homes all over the world, including Ireland, Switzerland, America, France, and of course London, his home. So he had homes everywhere. But he came to visit Kerry, Ireland during the tourist season, and he didn't have his makeup on, he didn't have his hair curled, he was just his ordinary self, and no one recognized him. And so there wasn't room, and so they just told him there's no room. Sorry, it's tourist season, you should have called ahead. And so he saw this little white house that you see. We couldn't get any closer than this, but you see it right there on the shoreline, the little white one. He saw it was for sale and just bought it. and so that became part of his claim to fame in Ireland. And so of course they, to apologize, put a statue of him within sight of the house. So that's Charlie Chaplin, tiny guy, and he that is his real size there. My son is like five, maybe 5'6", and Charlie Chaplin maybe 5'8". Don't count his hat. But that's how he ended up having a house in Kerry, Ireland. And of course, Kerry was mortified when they found out that they had turned away the most famous movie star in the world at the time. So let's watch that film clip. You'll enjoy it. Don't fast forward. I promise you'll enjoy it. It's pretty funny. So watch this. Very cool flick. So hopefully you're getting the idea that all of America is going through this massive, massive change in less than a decade. I mean, so much changed in that decade. So automobiles, we know that automobiles were first mass produced by Henry Ford using the assembly line. They were Model Ts, they were all black. But how did it change the world? Well, you got to have highways built, of course. So along those highways, you're going to have stores pop up, new towns pop up, and it's going to decrease that isolation. It was a lot harder to go find a place out in the country away from people if that's what you wanted to do. Fast food became the thing of the day too because people could drive through, pick up their food. This was a new thing, and everybody thought it was the most wonderful thing ever created. And by the way, the very first fast food chain was White Castle Hamburgers, which is still around today and still, in my opinion, the best hamburger. It's also, of course, automobiles are going to increase suburbanation. So people are moving out into the suburbs with single family homes. Don't have to live in the cities with the sounds all night. You have actual neighborhoods out in the middle of nowhere because you're connected by a highway now. And the big thing for people your age is that automobiles gave teenagers freedom for the first time. It used to be prior to automobiles, if you went on a date, it was very, very watched. You couldn't really get away. You might even only have your date on the front porch with mom and dad looking out the window. You just didn't have much freedom. But now kids can get in cars and go someplace. And so for the first time, teenagers are going to find some freedom. And let's see what happens to the girls. So during the early 1900s, you see the Gibson girl over here on the side. That is what the media showed to women in America. Like this was the epitome of the kind of girl you wanted to be. So she's still pretty heavily clothed, only her arms are hanging out, but she has that hourglass figure and the dress is allowed to cling to her, but she still has this wholesomeness to her. So the Gibson girl is very wholesome. Still trying to find herself, maybe educated, maybe not, never going to be super educated. She's a good girl. She does as she's told, but she's sexual enough to turn men on and become somebody's wife. So she's not too sexual. So the Gibson girl is kind of the goody goody of the early 1900s. But then the Gibson girl turns into the flapper. Clara Bow is probably one of the most famous of all the flappers in the 1920s. Flappers are actually trying to look more masculine. I know she looks super feminine, but they're trying to look more masculine to find equality. So they're going to smoke, they're going to drink, they're going to cut their hair short. Many of them actually wrapped their breast so that it looked like they didn't have any. So if you see pictures of flappers of the time, it looks like they have a kind of a boyish figure, and that was considered sexy though. And so the flappers are the girls that are going to go into the bars and the speakeasies and voice their opinion. And they do allow a little bit of not sexual activity, but a little more contact. Not just kissing on the front porch with mom and dad looking anymore. There's a little bit more hands on. But flappers are not bad girls. They're not going to let a man go all the way with them. If you were that kind of girl in this time period, you were actually called a vamp. And that's a flapper. She would look like Clara Bow, but she was also willing to allow a man to do things that you shouldn't do unless you're married in that time period. So flappers are the ones that act like they're bad, and will do things against the norm of society, while vamps actually are doing things against the norm of society. But all of them will reject tradition and challenge those social norms. So suddenly, girls are showing skin as flappers or as vamps, heavy makeup, extraordinary kinds of dresses, pearls, legs are showing, getting shorter and shorter and shorter. So, definitely challenging social norms and rejecting the world of their mothers and the world of the Gibson girl. The 1920s is also a time for new heroes in America, and Charles Lindbergh is going to be among the top ones of those heroes. So he is the he made the first solo transatlantic flight in his plane, the Spirit of St. Louis, and it immediately, of course, made him famous worldwide. That fame is actually going to lead to tragedy in his life. There's a new wave of crime in America, and it's kidnapping family members from rich families in exchange for money, and you get them back. So there was the Lindberghs had a son. His name is Charles Jr. Here he is, about 20 months old, and not long after this picture was taken, Charles will be kidnapped in the middle of the night. He's taken right out of his bed by this guy, Bruno Hopton. Hotman, sorry, Hotman. And of course, the Lindbergh family is going to get a kidnap note. I want this money. They don't give the money. They never get the baby back. It becomes this horrible media frenzy over where is the Lindbergh baby, where is the Lindbergh baby. And about 4 months after his kidnapping, they do arrest Bruno. They find the body of Charles Jr. not 4 miles from his house. He was actually partially buried right alongside a major highway. It's almost as if maybe they Bruno threw him out a window. But the cause of death was a severe blow to the head, which crushed his little skull. So Charles Lindbergh, of course, is never going to get over this, but there is a law that comes out of it. It's called the Lindbergh Law. And it used to be that if a criminal crossed state lines, in any case, kidnapping or whatever, if a criminal crossed state lines, now there's going to be kind of a lull because you have to notify the people in that state, the law enforcement in the new state. But with the Lindbergh Law, if a criminal, especially a kidnapper, crosses state lines, the federal government can move in and they don't have to notify anybody. They can just keep going after the guy, which saves time. And so the Lindbergh Law says that police can cross state lines. Federal and state police can cross state lines. So a horrible tragedy for the Lindberghs. He does stay together with his wife. They have five more children, but he's never the same after that. He has a really hard time with commitment. He has at least three other children by three affairs that he had, three different ladies. His eldest daughter once said that he was a serial adulterer. So he just never gets over the birth of his baby, and he kind of does crazy things. So there are other types of heroes too in America, and that would be in sports. Babe Ruth was voted the greatest baseball player of the 20th century and saw his team to seven World Series. So, all of these people, Charles Lindbergh, the first flight, transatlantic flight, Babe Ruth, the greatest baseball player, all in the 1920s. So, it's not just fads of the time and dress and music. It's like suddenly you have these individuals that are rising to fame and fortune all in the 1920s. So, again, just this fantastically changing society in America. There are also villains of the 1920s, and the top villain in America is Al Capone, more commonly known as Scarface during the time period. He was a bouncer at a bar when he was younger, and he made some kind of comment to a woman that was probably taken out of context, and her brother got really upset at him and slashed him across the face with a razor blade. And so you can see it in that top picture, see the scar, but that he ended up getting the nickname Scarface, which he hated. You would never say that to his face. But he's going to come up as the number one smuggler, bootlegger. He's into prostitution, gambling. He has a bunch of speakeasies, and you see the notice over here. I love this. His rules of the house. No extended credit, don't ask. No lettuce, no tiger milk. Um, I love this. In the event of a raid by the coppers, drink fast. But these are actually his real honest to goodness rules. So he is the number one gangster and starts the different gangs in Chicago and New York. Chicago is his hometown, and that's where he will be seen most often. But he's known as this big bad guy, but he did kind things as well. He is also the very first person to publicly say, like a well-known figure, to publicly say there is a problem here. Our people can't feed themselves. They can't feed their families. And so he is the first person in America to open a bread line during the Depression, and he did this in Chicago. He had his gangster men go out in the mornings and hand out bread to the poor. They look really happy standing there too, don't they? So when this made the newspapers, of course it's going to make the newspapers. Somebody called him kind, and he said that he was worried that people would mistake his kindness for weakness, and warned people not to ever do that. That he was kind to everyone until they gave him a reason not to be, and then you better look out, basically. So know him as the number one gangster of the time. Really got his foot in the door because of prohibition, and then he's going to expand his business into all these other things too. So let's take a look at one of the probably most villainous things he ever did in Chicago, and that is a massacre. So Capone was not the only mobster guy in Chicago, and so he was the main guy for the Italian gangsters. So Italians under Al Capone, but there was a large gathering of Irish gangsters as well, and their main leader was a guy by the name of Bugs Moran. So they were in severe competition with one another. They hated each other. Both of them were basically doing the same things: bootlegging and prostitution and gambling. So they were constantly in competition trying to get customers from one another. And it comes to a head on Valentine's Day. So it becomes known as the Valentine's Day Massacre, as Al Capone lures Bugs' men into an alleyway after dressing his own men like police officers. So Bugs' guys thinks that they're going to be arrested, and they take them into this alleyway and they shoot them all. Bugs was supposed to be there that day too, but he was running late, and so they didn't realize that they should have been waiting for Bugs. I guess maybe Capone didn't make that order clear, but it probably was to kill. The whole thing was probably meant to kill Moran. But again, he wasn't there. Seven of his men were gunned down. They never did link it to Capone, but Moran said only Capone kills like that. And so it became a pretty big deal. And the government decided it was time to do something about this man. He will become public enemy number one. And this is when they really start saying, we've got to get rid of him. And they start watching everything that he does. But they will never pin the St. Valentine's Day Massacre on Al Capone, not ever. So, like I said, they are not going to get him on any of the bad things that he did. They tried, and they got him to go to jail a couple times here and there for small stints at a time, a couple weeks kind of thing, maybe a month, but they couldn't ever make anything stick. And so finally, somebody realized that he hadn't been paying taxes. And so he is sent to jail for tax evasion in 1931 with an 11-year sentence, which is outrageous even for that time period. But they wanted to get him on something. So they gave him 11 years. You see at the top here is his first cell. Looks pretty nice, doesn't it? And somebody in the jail that was running the jail said, we're not going to give him any special anything. I don't care how much money the guy has. And he did have a lot of money. But they end up moving him to his famous cell 181 on Alcatraz Island in the prison called the Rock. And nobody's ever escaped the Rock. But none of this really mattered to Al Capone, because he knew that whatever was going to happen to him, that he wasn't going to live very long. And the reason is he had a disease called syphilis, and you get this, it's sexually transmitted, and he knew that he had gotten it from sleeping with prostitutes, and he was embarrassed to tell anyone, so he just let it fester and go on for years. And syphilis, if it goes untreated, will actually eat your brain. And so in the end, he couldn't do anything. He couldn't put two words together. He couldn't read. He couldn't write. And he doesn't fulfill that 11-year sentence. He only lives for another 8 years. And it is his heart that finally gives out.
but all of that was a result of him having syphilis. And so you can still go today to Alcatraz Island and see cell 181. Supposedly his spirit came back to haunt that prison cell. Who knows? But the mighty Al Capone finally put down for tax evasion and left to die in Alcatraz. I think you're kind of getting it that the 1920s is a time of experimentation and pushing the limits of society. And of course, it's going to also affect the schools. And so there became this case that became known as the Scopes Monkey Trial. And it really was Christian fundamentalism versus evolution. So, following that literal interpretation of the Bible versus evolution. And this is going to happen in Tennessee in 1925 when a law called the Butler Law was created that made it illegal to teach evolution in the classroom. Now, John Scopes was a biology teacher. He was only a substitute, but he decided that he was going to challenge that law and he was going to teach evolution in his classroom anyway, through like a scientific study of evolution. He wasn't telling the children the Bible was bad or the Bible was evil. He was just teaching them about evolution and the things that scientists have found and allowing the kids to make up their mind. He had no idea what storm he was causing. It's actually going to go to trial what he did. He's going to be fired. It's going to go to trial what he did, and it becomes known as the Scopes Monkey Trial. The two men who are in charge of arguing in the courtroom are William Jennings Bryan, that should say William Jennings Bryan, and he said it was a contest between evolution and Christianity, and he was willing to make it a duel to the death versus Clarence Darrow, who says Bryan is a bigot and he wants to put him out of business. So William Jennings Bryan is for the Christian side that you shouldn't be teaching evolution, versus Clarence Darrow that says you're a bigot, evolution exists, you need to be quiet about it. So in the end, it's you've got poor Scopes, John Scopes, stuck between these two loudmouth men that are trying to make a point and make themselves famous. And in the end, Scopes is still fired. He was only a substitute to begin with, but he's never going to teach again. He's found guilty, charged $100. He never pays that fine, but his life is pretty much ruined over it, and it makes William Jennings Bryan and Clarence Darrow famous. So they got all the good they could out of poor John Scopes, and the Butler Law stayed in place. But the problem is, if the Butler Law is worded so that it kind of crosses that line between federal government, church, and state involvement. And so it will be challenged again. But know that John Scopes loses, and it is a media frenzy at the time. A lot of people will make money off of this. Right outside the courthouse, they had somebody brought a monkey. I can't remember the monkey's name, but he could do things like play the piano. He smoked a pipe. They had all kinds of paraphernalia for both sides that people were making money on, and it really did become a media frenzy, and it set America against one another yet again, those who said evolution could be true and those who said there's no way it's true. And so it was just a crazy, crazy frenzy with a monkey and John Scopes stuck in the middle of it. So America's going to become pretty daggone paranoid about a lot of things, not just religion. But in the 1920s, what were we most paranoid about? Communism. Communism became a real threat to American society, at least in our minds. It was a real threat once the Bolshevik Revolution took place in Russia. Now, I hope you remember this. During World War One, the Russians are going to have to pull out of the war because they are having a revolution at home, and that revolution took place under the leadership of Vladimir Lenin, who was a leader of the Bolsheviks and wanted to overthrow the last czar of Russia, which would have been Tsar Nicholas II. He kidnaps the family. They are held in the Winter Castle for a year. Lenin is made leader after another war, another civil war. It's several rounds of war, and he is fighting his own people, his own Bolsheviks. So it becomes the red Bolsheviks versus the white Bolsheviks, and the Reds, of course, will win. The Reds were the ones that wanted communism, and that's why we have the color red associated with communism. So he is successful. He uses Marxist teachings and scares the crap out of America. So suddenly, we think that there are Russian spies everywhere, communist spies everywhere, and we start treating communism like it is a disease. And if you have anything to do with somebody that's communist, they will infect you. So it becomes a real scare in America, and it becomes known as the Red Scare because the color of communism is red. So let's take a deeper look at the Red Scare. The Red Scare is basically the United States going crazy. Citizens were told that they were to act as the watchdogs of democracy and question everything as a commie action or comment, everything and everyone. And you see the examples here. A Connecticut clothing salesman sentenced to 6 months just because he said Lenin was smart. Lenin was smart. He was smart. I think the police might come get me any minute, but he was smart. In Chicago, a sailor shot another man just because he didn't rise during the national anthem. Can you imagine what those people would think of America today and the things that we do, and say about our flag? Come on. The KKK is even going to change. So they have all these people that they're against, but they're going to add the Nazis because they are communist and birth control advocates, Jews, bootleggers, gamblers. And by the way, Nazis are not communist. That is an absolute inaccuracy, but America wasn't smart enough to realize that. Nazis are socialist, not communist. Hitler thought that communism was stupid. How could everybody be completely, totally equal? So he was a socialist, but the KKK was too dumb to realize that, and so they added Nazis to their list of people that they would kill. So, how do we get that paranoid, so paranoid that it's okay to kill somebody or put somebody in jail for one little comment and nobody's going to punish them for it? Well, there are certain people who added to that paranoia. A. Mitchell Palmer is one of the worst. Now, he's the Attorney General in D.C., which means he has a lot of clout. But he was the victim of a targeted bombing, which destroyed his house. It was one of 7 bombs that were placed all over D.C., including one on Wall Street. And A. Mitchell Palmer came to the belief that he was being targeted by communists and he was scared. And so, in his eyes, everyone was under suspicion. And he created something called the Palmer Raids, where his men would go out and police the city. And if anybody seemed suspicious whatsoever, he could search their house, their car, their person with no kind of warrant, no nothing. He deported every alien that he could get his hands on. The most that he deported in a single day was 250, and he got people very convinced that there were communist spies everywhere. And it's taking away American rights. You can't invade somebody's home without a search warrant and nothing more than a idea that you feel suspicious of them. But A. Mitchell Palmer made that the way of the land in DC, especially in the 1920s, because of his own fears. So the United States, this is so stupid. The United States bought a ship, and it was called the USS Buford. It was nicknamed across the world the Soviet Ark, and anybody that we thought was a Soviet spy or a communist, we put them on this ship and took them out of America. We don't care where you go, but we don't want you here. So it ended up that we sent most of these people to Finland. And you see down here, carried nearly 300 to Finland. Finland was willing to take these people. They knew that it was an idiot thing that we were doing. And so that Soviet arc makes us the joke of the world in the 1920s. So we go from the Great White Fleet, and being everybody's saving grace to the Soviet arc and being everybody's favorite joke because of our paranoia over communism. Of course, there's going to be a backlash in America too. Not everybody is on board with this crazy idea that communism is a disease that spreads. And so you see these people marching for free speech. We should be able to say and do what we want without being under suspicion. but it doesn't get a whole lot of media coverage. It doesn't seem like our leaders are taking it seriously that America is upset until an event takes place where two men by the name of Seiko and Vanzetti are going to be executed, unfairly executed. So let's look at their story. Nikolai Seiko was a just a shoemaker. Bartolomeo Vanzetti was a fish peddler. They're both Italian immigrants. They did both openly speak out against the government, not for communism, but they spoke out against the American government, said it wasn't fair. They were seen as radicals. And on top of that, they were also friends with that guy who blew up Palmer's house. And I didn't tell you this part when we talked about Palmer, but the man who blew up Palmer's house killed himself in that explosion. He didn't mean to, but he killed himself. And so when this next event happens in Boston, Massachusetts, 1920, a paymaster and guard is shot, money is stolen, $15,000, no witnesses, the public is demanding justice. Palmer uses that as an excuse to go after anybody and everybody who was associated with that guy who blew his house up. I told you he was super paranoid and he really thought this man that blew his house up was part of a bigger regime and they were all out to get him. So he starts really going into the background of this dead man's friends and acquaintances and comes up with Seiko and Vanzetti, who were very loud about how they felt about our government. And so, with no witnesses, no evidence, no nothing at all, these two men are brought to court and accused of killing this paymaster and stealing the money. And it really was a sham from the very beginning. The lawyer that they had, their own lawyer that they were given in court, hated Italians and kept making rude comments about Italians. So did the guy who was in charge of the jury, the head juryman. He was making comments about people being Italians being, violent, and we shouldn't allow them in the United States. The two men were not allowed to just sit in the courtroom. They were kept in a metal cage in the courtroom, like they were so evil we can't leave them out of the cage. So the whole thing was a sham. Of course they're going to be accused of this, they're going to be found guilty, and they will both be executed, and they're lynched, and it is done in public. Once they're killed, people really start to question what happened here. I guess we started feeling guilty over it. But this will end the Palmer raids with the death of these two men, Seiko and Vanzetti, and maybe they did do it. Who knows? But they were never given a fair shot at us finding the truth. We just sentenced them to die, and in retrospect, America felt really guilty over it. Palmer raids are stopped completely. This whole thing goes back to you can search whoever you want whenever you want in the Palmer raids. That's going to die off now. No, that dies with Seiko and Vanzetti, and people start turning against Palmer. On more than one occasion, Palmer claimed that he had information about some bombs that were going to be exploded in DC, and neither event actually happened. And so he kind of starts to look like an idiot. So the death of Seiko and Vanzetti ends the Palmer raids, it ends anybody's belief in Palmer, and it also ends that first wave of the Red Scare. It's going to come back, but it's over for now. Still in the 1920s, we've talked about society changes, heroes, villains, and now let's talk about some of the real villains in politics. So, the election of 1920, Cox and Roosevelt are running on the Democratic ticket, and that would be Franklin Roosevelt, not Teddy. And then on the Republican ticket, we have Harding and Coolidge. So, make sure you can name those names for me if I ask you. 1920. Let's look at the map. So Cox is going to get a huge section of the vote in the South, but it's not going to be quite enough. So we're going to end up having Harding become president in the election of 1920. Warren Harding was what we call a dark horse president. He was the last dark horse president, and basically that means that political leaders chose him. He was not elected, he was selected by very rich men. Remember, we're coming out of World War I. People really just want things to be normal. They don't want a fantastic president that's going to make a lot of changes and cause uproar. They just want a normal, regular guy. So Harding is elected with the expectancy that he will be really super easy to control by these super rich guys, and he's going to run on that platform, return to normalcy. And again, he's a dark horse, which means nobody really knew him. He was from Ohio. He didn't have this fantastic political career, but he seemed reasonable. He seemed likable, and so he is going to be made president. So he does do some things for government. He helps through the government. He helps big businesses by lowering taxes that are hurting them, raising taxes that will help them, lowering taxes for individuals. So things like that, nothing fantastic, but it's helpful, and people liked him for it. He also created a group that was their only job was to look at government spending and to find out where we were losing money. And so for the first time ever, the government has these babysitters watching and making sure that we're not overspending. And there are ridiculous things like a toilet cover that costs $400, that kind of stuff. That's going to stop under Harding because they're being investigated for the first time. He was also, as president, approached by a former president, President Taft. Taft wanted to become a Supreme Court judge. He is the only ex president to ever become a Supreme Court judge. He didn't do anything fantastic, but it's neat to know that Warren Harding, remember, the president is the one who selects the people who serve on the Supreme Court judge, or as a Supreme Court judge, and Taft was granted the position by Harding. It was approved by Congress, and so Taft becomes our first and only Supreme Court judge as an ex president. Now, people did love Harding. He's a nice looking man. He was friendly, except for his many affairs. He did have lots and lots of affairs. His wife, Florence, you see her here. She knew about them. Some of them were her friends, some of them were her secretaries. I'm going to let you listen to a video clip in a little bit that will explain those affairs much better. But people still loved him until he died, and then things are going to come out about him. So he had a lot of stress and strain going on in his life with all these affairs and scandals, and you'll hear more about that in a minute. But he was having a rough time as president. He'd only been president a little over 2 years, and a lot was happening behind closed doors that he was trying to deal with and keep it from going into the public. He was going on tour. He was in Alaska when he started not feeling well. Alaska wasn't even a state yet, but he was there, and he started not feeling well, and they thought that maybe he had food poisoning at first, but then it became pneumonia. He's getting sicker and sicker, and his wife was reading to him in bed one night, and he kind of started to have a fit, like a convulsive fit, and then he died. And he died of a massive heart attack at the age of 57. So when he dies is when we're going to learn what was really happening while he was president. All right, so like I said, when he died, Calvin Coolidge is going to be the president because he's the vice president. So Calvin Coolidge is going to take his place, and when he does, all of these secrets of what was happening under Warren Harding's presidency is going to come to the surface. So I'm going to let you listen to the video that's going to explain not only the affairs that I mentioned before, and there are letters, and we will read a little bit of those in class. But it will tell you a little bit about those, and it will tell you about some of the other scandals. I do want you to take notes. You could not make up this story and make it a better story. It is just scandal and lies and all kinds of great stuff. So as you're listening, you don't have to remember the names of all the women he had affairs with, but just remember the gist of it. I do want you to focus on the Teapot Dome scandal and some of the other scandals that will be mentioned. Make sure you know that Albert Fall will be the first cabinet member ever put in prison. He is going to take the fall for Harding and for Daughtry. Now, we don't know how much of this Harding knew about. There's no way to link him to anything, but Daughtry definitely knew things, and that guy will never be caught. But anyway, I don't want to give away all the secrets. Watch the video. I'll stop talking. Let's look at how Calvin Coolidge became president. Can you believe all that stuff about Harding? Wow, what a video. All right, so he went by the nickname of Cool Cal or Silent Cal because he talked very little. He never took part in just casual conversation. You were never going to sit around and chit chat with Calvin Coolidge. That worked for him and against him. People thought that he was kind of snobby on one hand, but when he did talk, people listened because he didn't talk very often. So they assumed it must be something really important. So he gets a phone call that he's visiting his father, and he gets a phone call that the president has passed away and you're now going to be the president. Well, his father was a notary, and so a notary has the right to swear in a president. And so his own dad in his house swore him in as president right there. So, Cool Cal becomes president, never spent money or words easily. That's the best way to remember this guy.
Calvin Coolidge didn't have a fantastic presidency. There was nothing exceptional about it. He is only going to finish out the Harding's 2 years and then do a four of his own, and then that's it. But he was a very honest man and had a reputation as such, and so he was worried coming in on the heels of Harding what might fall in his lap. And so he very openly cleaned house on corruption, hired whoever he had to hire to investigate any kind of funny business going on while Harding was president, and exposed everyone and anyone that he could. Of course, he's never going to get Daughtry, but a lot of people are going to be fired, removed, put in jail, fined, and so he does literally clean house. His favorite phrase was the business of America is business, and so he very much like Harding was on board with helping out big businesses. His philosophy, like Harding's, was that if businesses are healthy, their employees will be healthy and the overall economy will be healthy. But he was a little bit extreme when it came to the laissez faire mentality, no government intervention in business. He literally did nothing to intervene in business. And so you could really say that his policies kind of set in motion the things that will happen that will lead to the Great Depression because it was completely hands off with these big businesses. So, low taxes during his presidency, high protective tariffs, that's goods coming into the country. And so everybody felt like things were going well, and good times were on their side. But he is going to pick big business over farmers, just like Harding did, and several presidents before him. And so, on the heels of World War I, that's going to be a problem. But during his presidency, it seems like everything is fine. So overall, like I said, the economic welfare of our nation right after World War I into the 1920s was wonderful. We had a very short recession after World War I, but then we bounced right back. Wait, you can see wages rising, low unemployment. The government and banks had a very easy money policy. Anybody could get credit for anything. Our stock market's doing really well, and people started doing something called buying on margin, and using credit. You know what credit is, but buying on margin is exactly what you see over here in this picture. You make a down payment to buy stock, not paying the full price. Usually it's 10% down, so you want $10,000 worth of stock. You put down 1,000, and then the other 9,000 is loaned to you through a stockbroker. So you can buy a lot of taxes for not very much money. That sounds good, but it can lead to very bad things when that stockbroker decides to start calling in his debts if there's money trouble. And so that's what's going to happen, and it's going to lead us even further down the path during or to the depression. So buying on margin, make sure you know what that is, and you all know what credit is. But credit was ready for anybody and everybody to take it on a whim. While the rest of America is celebrating in their wealth, basically, the farmers are feeling that something is wrong. So, the minute that World War I ends, of course, there's going to be a decreased demand for grain that we have been supplying to all these foreign powers that were too busy to worry about farming while they were fighting.
So immediately prices are going to be lowered because we want people to buy, the farmers want people to buy their goods. And because the prices are lower and we have a surplus that's not being sold, these loans that farmers had been able to get very easily during the war, now they can't pay them back. During the war, the banks were basically willing to give farmers anything that they wanted. And so some of them had astronomically high loans, thinking that, hey, as long as the war is going on, I can pay all these debts. And now the war is over, and they've gone too far into debt, and lowering their prices, not being able to sell their goods is the reason for it. So you would think that the government is going to step in. I mean, farmers are pretty important. We all have to eat. But you got to remember that Harding and Coolidge felt that the farmers were the last thing in the country to worry about. And so they're not going to get any help. The only thing that they're worrying about, these presidents, is big business. So the little guy, especially the farmer, gets absolutely nothing. Farmers start feeling this very early in the 1920s, and nobody is paying attention to it, but it is the very first step towards the Great Depression. While other people in society are getting wealthier and wealthier, these guys are getting poorer and poorer, to the point where banks are starting to take their land and their homes and their crops away from them. They tried to stick together, the farmers did, and they started something called penny auctions, where the bank would hold an auction and all the neighbors would come, and the highest bid, this was an agreement they made in advance, the highest bid that they would give the bank on the farm was a penny. And then after the deal was done, that neighbor would give the farm back to the original owner in exchange for another penny. And so there, it truly did cost a penny. But of course, the banks are going to get wise to that. There's going to be laws made about it almost immediately. So there is not going to be any help for the farmers. So if someone asks you where the Great Depression begins, don't say the stock market crash. That drives me insane. That was just one part of it. It actually starts with the farmers, and nobody's paying attention. Let's look at what's happening um, in foreign affairs. So you hopefully know that Germany, after World War One, had to do three main things according to the Treaty of Versailles. They had to give up their military, they had to take blame for the war, and they had to pay for the entire war. So they were given bills by every country that was involved in the war except for America. America did not give them a bill. America felt bad for Germany, and so we decided to create something called the Dawes Plan. Now, originally it was created by two men with the last name Dawes and Young, but Young looked at what it was going to actually be once they were done working the plan out, and he said, this is stupid, take my name off of it. So the guy who created it said, no, take my name off of it. That should be a pretty good indication right there that this is not a good idea. But Dawes said, this is what we're doing, and he ran it through. And of course, Herbert Hoover is going to say, great, let's do it. And so the Dawes plan basically was us every month giving Germany money to pay their debt to the rest of the allies. And so those allies, of course, owe us money. And so they would take their monthly payment they got from Germany and they would give it to us. And then we would give it back to Germany. Germany would give it to the allies. The allies would give it to us. So nobody's making any money. We're just floating money in a circle. But it was working. It worked until people in America started realizing that there was something wrong, that the economy was not as strong as we thought it was. The government starts to feel a little bit of a ripple as well, and they can't pay the monthly installment to Germany. So this Dawes plan linked Germany, all the allies, and us economically. And so when America, who was really the start of it all, falls out of this circle because we are having money problems here in America, it is going to affect everybody that is involved in this Dawes plan, and that is a lot of countries. We're talking Greece, Britain, France. This is far reaching. This is far reaching, and so we don't only have a Great Depression here in America, we caused a depression in the rest of the world. So we like to think that the Great Depression of the 1930s was an American event, and it was, but it was also a worldwide event. because of us. And so don't forget our part in it. So let's look at that stock market. Again, don't think that that this caused the Great Depression. It did not. It was one thing in the Great Depression. These things not being bought anymore from foreign powers, and so there was a lot of over speculation of stocks, which basically means you bought a stock thinking it was going to be worth more than it was, so you paid too much. You over speculated. Don't forget there are people buying on margin, so you might have a lot of stock, but you owe a whole lot of money for buying that stock. Growth in companies slowed, of course, because companies were overproducing, thinking, well, last year we made 5,000 chairs. We'll make that many this year, but nobody's buying them because the foreign powers don't need us anymore, and that's who had been buying our stuff. So companies are going to overproduce. Stuff's going to be sitting in warehouses not being sold, and so growth is going to slow down until finally all this culminates into something that went in the history books as Black Tuesday. So October 29th, 1929 is when the stock market crashes, and this is when everyone's going to suddenly realize, oh my gosh, there is something wrong. And so on this day, 10/29/29, everybody was selling their stock, no one was buying, which means the price of stock hit rock bottom. Absolutely rock bottom. And so all of this is going to end up collapsing our banking system. The Great Depression is here. Borrowers cannot repay their loans. They've lost everything. The money supply, of course, is going to shrink. Nobody's going to spend anything. And there's going to be an absolute immediate run on banks, which basically means people lining the streets, waiting for the bank doors to open so they can go in and clean out their accounts and take their money home and hide it someplace. They're in fear for the life of their money. And most of these people are going to go into the bank and find out there is no money. Your money's gone. There's no insurance in this time period. If your bank collapses with your money inside, too bad, so sad, bye bye money. There's nothing that you can do about it. And so most of these people are going to be told your money is gone. And that's going to lead to a lot of very public suicides. People jumping from the ledges of tall buildings in cities once they find out that everything they work for is gone. This is a really scary time in America. So people are basically shutting their doors. Unemployment skyrockets overnight. How can you pay an employee if you've got stuff sitting in a warehouse that's never going to be sold? So, how does Herbert Hoover propose to fix this? Herbert Hoover decides to create something called the Hawley Smoot Act in 1929, and it is named after the two men who created it, Hawley and Smoot. Sometimes you'll see it as Smoot Hawley, but this basically created the highest tariff on foreign goods coming into America that has ever been put into place. Some of the ports were as high as 60%. A couple of them even made it to 100% interest. And so, or tax, I'm sorry, tax. And so foreign countries are not going to be able to sell their goods in America. Their goods are going to be too expensive. And these foreign countries are not going to take that lightly. They've lost America basically because of the American government as a trading partner. And so if America can do it, then they can do it too. And so countries across the world created retaliatory tariffs against us. They were mad at us. And so they retaliated with tariffs of their own. And everybody's tariffs were too high for foreign trade to take place. So America, through the Hawley Smoot Act, completely collapsed world trade. Again, just like with the Dawes Act, we are at fault for shutting down trade across the world. So we took money away from everybody through the Dawes Act, and now we stopped the trade and any new money coming in through the Hawley Smoot Act. Yeah, America is not doing very well, are we? So we're now going to start talking about the Great Depression itself and what life was like during that time period. You know the causes of it, so let's find out what life was like.